At the gala, my daughter, in-law's voice sliced through the music like a knife. God, Margaret, can you embarrass us anymore? You're a walking disaster. I froze. The room smelled of roses and champagne, but all I tasted was metal. In my hand, the empty dessert plate still bore a smear of chocolate like a crime scene. Across from me, her father stood rigid in his cream, white suit, a dark blotch of mousse blooming on the fabric. Gas rippled soft at first, then louder, sharper. $40,000? Someone hissed just loud enough for me to hear. Vanessa tilted her head, lips curling. Maybe next time, stay home where you can't ruin anything. See my cheeks burned, hot enough to scald. Thomas, my only son, stood a few feet away, holding a champagne flute like it was an anchor. He didn't move toward me. Didn't say a word. His eyes slid away, landing on the chandelier instead. In that instant, 20 years of Sunday dinners, birthday cakes, and midnight hospital runs slammed into me. Every sacrifice, every stitch in his childhood sweaters, every bill I paid without complaint, suddenly weightless, invisible. And now, I was just a problem to be contained. The quartet kept playing, but the violin sounded thin, almost mocking. I set the plate on a passing waiter's tray, my fingers numb. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a thought surfaced, bitter and absurd. So this is what the end of a mother's relevance sounds like. I turned to leave. My heels sank into the plush carpet, each step an effort. Behind me, laughter bubbled, hers high and sharp. Someone whispered, she should be grateful she was even invited. The air outside was cool and salted from the nearby harbor. I pulled my shawl tighter, but the chill came from inside. Street lamps threw long shadows across the cobblestones, and I walked without direction. My chest felt hollow, like a room stripped of furniture. Inside my house, lavender lingered from the sachet in the entryway. I slipped off my heels, the relief sharp against the ache in my arches. On the hall table, my invitation lay where I'd left it. Thick cardstock, gold lettering, a promise of belonging that had never been real. In the kitchen, I filled the kettle. The hiss of gas catching matched the hiss in my ears. Vanessa's words repeated, bright and cruel, you're a walking disaster. I braced my palms on the cool counter, grounding myself in its solid weight. Thomas had sounded so different when he'd invited me. We'll be front and center, Mom. I want you there. I'd believed him, chosen the velvet dress, polished my handbag, rehearsed small talk in the mirror. All to stand under those chandeliers and be dismissed like a stranger. The kettle hummed, steam fogged the cabinet glass. I poured hot water over a tea bag, chamomile rising soft and familiar. At the kitchen table, the wood scarred from years of meals and homework sessions, I saw Thomas as a boy, hair in his eyes, asking me for answers. When did my voice become the one he ignored? Vanessa entered his life like a tide, quick, charming, leaving no room for hesitation. At first, I thought she brought happiness. Then small things piled up, holidays moved, for convenience. My name missing from donor lists, photos from events I never knew about. Tonight wasn't the first time she'd tried to shrink me. It was just the first time the walls closed in fast enough for everyone to see. My gaze drifted to the wooden chest in the living room corner. My husband's chest. He'd told me to open it only if I needed to remember who I was. I knelt, traced the carved edge, flipped the brass latch inside. Cedar scent greeted me. On top lay an envelope in his handwriting. Beneath it, folders I hadn't touched in years, investments, property deeds, sealed board meeting minutes. Humiliation cooled into something heavier, steadier, an intention. Vanessa thought tonight ended with my disgrace. Thomas thought silence was safer than taking my side. Neither knew how quietly power could shift. They would never see it coming. Stay with me. If it were you, would you fight or walk away? The morning light filtered through the lace curtains, pale and unhurried, as if it didn't know my world had tilted. I stayed in bed for a while, listening to the steady tick of the clock on the dresser. The air felt heavy, like it had soaked up the shame from the night before. The faint aroma of coffee drifted from the kitchen. I'd set the pot last night, a habit from years of early shifts. Pulling on my robe, the cotton soft against my skin, I padded barefoot down the hall. The floorboards gave their familiar creak under my weight. Steam rose from the coffee pot as I poured a cup. The mug was warm in my hands, the bitter scent rising with the curl of steam. I took a sip, and the taste was steadying, strong, slightly burnt, just the way I'd always made it. For a moment, it was enough to loosen the knot in my chest. Memories came easily in the quiet. Thomas at 8 years old, hair sticking out in every direction, grinning over a plate of pancakes. Me in my nurse's scrubs, hurrying home between shifts to pack his lunch. Nights spent sewing patches on his jeans by the glow of the kitchen lamp, my fingers aching but my heart certain it was worth it. When his father died, Thomas was 17. I remember gripping his hand through the entire service, the way his shoulders trembled when no one else was looking. We sold the lake cabin to cover his tuition. I never told him how I sat in the car afterward, sobbing into the steering wheel until my breath hurt. Vanessa appeared 2 years later. The first time Thomas brought her to Sunday dinner, she wore a silk blouse the color of cream and spoke about her family's art gallery as if it were the center of the world. She smiled at me politely, asked about my garden, but her eyes kept drifting to Thomas, like she was already mapping out a future that didn't include me. At first, I wanted to believe she cared for him the way I always had, fiercely without condition. But over time, her voice sharpened when she addressed me, her compliments grew thinner, holidays shifted to her parents' home, my name slipped from donor lists, photos appeared of events I hadn't been invited to. The changes were small, but they stacked like bricks, building a wall I couldn't climb. I looked down at my coffee, now cooling in my hands. The quiet in the house wasn't restful anymore, it felt watchful, waiting, and in the corner of the living room, the wooden chest waited too. Not as a memory, but as the beginning of something I hadn't dared to imagine in years. I carried my coffee into the living room, the mug warming my palm as I crossed the worn rug. The morning sun slanted through the tall windows, lighting the dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. The wooden chest sat in its usual place by the wall, unremarkable to anyone else. But to me it was a sealed chapter of my life. I knelt beside it, the wood cool under my fingertips. The carved edges were smooth from years of care, the brass latch dulled with time. I traced the latch without opening it, as if touching it might stir my husband's voice in the room. He told me once, in that steady way of his, "Margaret, if you ever doubt your place in this world, this will remind you. For years I had no need. I thought my place was clear, mother, nurse, wife, the one who kept the world from falling apart. But last night had shown me how quickly those titles could be stripped, how easily love could turn into polite dismissal." I released the latch. The sound was small, but it carried through the stillness. The lid lifted with a faint sigh, releasing the scent of cedar and old paper. Inside lay neatly stacked folders, each marked in my husband's precise handwriting. On top, an envelope with my name. I set the coffee on the floor and opened the envelope. His handwriting looped across the page, firm and deliberate. He reminded me of the investments he had made, the shares he had protected, and the stipulations he had placed to ensure I could never be pushed aside. He wrote of the hotel chain, the very one that hosted last night's gala, and how part of it would always be mine. I read the letter twice, my eyes catching on the same line. "You have more power than they know." The words were like a key turning in a lock somewhere deep inside me. The humiliation from last night was still there, but it was no longer raw. It had settled into something heavier, something that could be shaped. I slid the letter back into its envelope and tucked it on top of the pile. My hands rested on the edges of the chest for a moment before I closed it gently. I sat back on my heels, the morning light now stronger, cutting bright shapes across the rug. There would be time to read every document, to understand exactly what I held. But for now, I let the knowledge settle. I wasn't as powerless as they believed. And that truth, kept quiet, might be my greatest advantage. 3 days passed before I saw Vanessa again. The air in Charleston was warm for early spring, heavy with the scent of wisteria. I was at the local market, picking through ripe tomatoes when her voice cut in behind me. "Well, if it isn't Charleston's most graceful guest," she said, each word dipped in sugar. I turned. A tomato still in my hand. She stood with 2 of her friends, both dressed in linen and pearls, their smiles tight and watchful. "I didn't expect to see you here," I said, keeping my tone even. Her eyes flicked to the tomato, then to my worn canvas tote. "I suppose you have to cook for yourself now." "After, well, everything." One of her friends stifled a laugh. I set the tomato gently into my bag, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. But my fingers trembled, the skin at the back of my neck prickling. Vanessa stepped closer, her perfume sharp and floral. "You know, Daddy still hasn't gotten the suit cleaned." $40,000, Margaret. He says it might be ruined forever." Her voice dropped to a mock, concerned whisper. "Accidents happen, but they say clumsiness is a sign of age." The words landed with a sting I felt in my chest. Images of the gala flashed, her glare, Thomas's silence. The smear of chocolate on expensive cloth. I wanted to tell her I hadn't even caused the spill, that someone had bumped me from behind. But the truth was clear. She wasn't after an explanation. She wanted an audience. I looked past her to the rows of fresh herbs, letting her words hang in the air unanswered. Her friends shifted, as if waiting for me to snap back. Instead, I reached for a bundle of basil, its scent sharp and clean, grounding me. "Enjoy your shopping, Vanessa?" I said, my voice steady. It wasn't much, but it was all I would give her there, among the tomatoes and curious eyes. She smirked. "Oh, I always do." They drifted away in a cloud of perfume and hushed laughter. I stood still for a moment, the basil warm in my palm, my pulse slowly easing. On the walk home, I replayed her words, the smug tilt of her chin. This was no longer about an accident. She was setting a stage, brick by brick, to paint me as someone to be pitied or ignored. By the time I reached my porch, the air had cooled, carrying a faint briny tang from the harbor. I unlocked the door, the quiet inside wrapping around me. The wooden chest sat where I had left it, patient and silent. Whatever came next, I knew I couldn't let her keep writing the story for me. That evening, Thomas called. His voice was flat, almost rehearsed. "Vanessa mentioned she saw you at the market." He began, skipping any greeting. I sat at the kitchen table, the basil from earlier now in a jar of water. "She did?" I said. "And she had plenty to say." He cleared his throat. "Look, Mom, maybe just let it go. She's sensitive about the suit." Sensitive. The word burned on my tongue. She humiliated me in front of strangers. Again. There was a pause, the faint sound of clinking glass in the background. "She's under a lot of stress," he said finally. "We all are." The gala was important for her family. I looked at the phone, imagining his expression, tired, impatient, avoiding my eyes if we were face to face. "Thomas," I said softer now. "When did my dignity become something you could trade for her comfort?" He didn't answer. The silence stretched, heavy and awkward. "I'll talk to her," he said at last, but the words felt like an empty envelope, promising nothing inside. After we hung up, the house seemed even quieter. I sat for a long time, the ticking of the clock marking the space between then and now. Through the window, the streetlight cast a pale cone on the sidewalk, the rest swallowed in shadow. I thought about the years I'd carried him through storms, literal and otherwise. About the nights I'd driven through rain to pick him up, the times I'd defended him when no one else would. And now he stood by, letting Vanessa turn me into the butt of her jokes. The next afternoon, I received an invitation to a family brunch at their house. The handwriting was Vanessa's, neat and slanted. A sticky note on the front read, "Dress appropriately. It's a formal gathering." The words were harmless on the surface, but I could hear her tone in my head. I almost crumpled the note, but instead I placed it on the counter, smoothing the edges. If she wanted an audience for her games, I would give her one, on my terms. When Sunday came, I dressed in a simple navy skirt and a cream blouse. Not flashy, not frayed, unassailable. The morning was warm, the scent of salt from the harbor mingling with blooming jasmine. I arrived on time, stepping into their polished entryway, the marble floor cold beneath my soles. Vanessa greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Margaret," she said brightly, "so glad you could make it. We have plenty of seating in the kitchen." Her friend's laughter floated from the dining room, light and sharp. I felt my hands tighten around my handbag, the leather warm from the walk over. I took a slow breath, letting the moment settle. She thought she was in control. But control has more than one face. The brunch table gleamed under the morning light, silverware aligned like soldiers. Vanessa moved between guests, her voice sweet, her eyes calculating. I sat at the far end, next to an empty chair, my plate filled but untouched. Halfway through the meal, Thomas leaned toward me. "Mom, could we talk after?" His tone was casual, but his eyes flicked toward Vanessa. I nodded, already bracing for whatever was coming. When the plates were cleared, he led me into the study, a room that smelled faintly of leather and dust. The blinds were half closed, casting stripes of shadow across the desk. A stack of papers sat waiting, the edges crisp, a pen placed neatly on top. "It's just a formality," Thomas began, gesturing for me to sit. I stayed standing. What kind of formality? Vanessa appeared in the doorway, holding a folder against her hip. "It's about the hotel shares Dad left you," she said smoothly. "We've found a way to streamline management." My pulse quickened. Streamline. The word felt like a trap. Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It means less paperwork for you. We'll handle everything, you just sign here." I looked at the top page. The language was dense, But one phrase leapt out, my transfer of voting rights. My husband's letter echoed in my mind, where you have more power than they know. Vanessa stepped closer, her perfume sharp. Margaret, these decisions are complicated. This would free you from all that stress. I met her gaze. Stress isn't what worries me. Her smile tightened. We're offering to take care of it. For family? I thought of the gala at the market, every subtle cut she'd delivered. Of course she wanted me out of the boardroom, but I kept my voice level. I'll need to review these with my attorney. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. Mom, is that really necessary? Yes, I said. It is. Silence pressed in, thick enough to feel. Vanessa's nails tapped the folder, a slow, deliberate rhythm. Fine, she said. But the sooner you sign, the sooner we can move forward. I left the study with the papers in my bag, the weight of them heavier than it should have been. In the foyer, sunlight streamed through the glass, making the marble floor glow. I stepped outside, the air warm and salt, tinged, and drew a steady breath. They thought I didn't see the game they were playing. But I'd learned long ago, the most dangerous move is the one no one sees coming. Back home, I placed the folder on the dining table. The afternoon light poured through the bay window, pooling over the polished wood. I sat down, the chair creaking, and began to read. The language was deliberate, pages of clauses and sub-clauses. But certain lines burned clear: full transfer, irrevocable, majority consent. Each phrase was a door closing behind me, locking me out of decisions my husband had wanted me to keep. I pulled my reading glasses from my pocket and leaned closer. Buried among the legal jargon was another line, small, but poisonous: authorization for asset liquidation. It wasn't just my voting rights they wanted. They could sell what was mine and walk away without asking. The smell of coffee from the morning still lingered in the air, faint and stale. I stood, poured a fresh cup, and took it back to the table. The heat steadied my hands enough to keep turning pages. Midway through the stack, I found an appendix listing current holdings. I read it once, then again, my stomach tightening. One account. An investment portfolio showed a withdrawal from 3 months ago. Not small. Enough to buy a waterfront property in Charleston. My mind spun through possibilities, each one leading back to the same place: Thomas and Vanessa. I remembered her sudden new car, the trip they'd taken to Paris on points, the renovations to her parents' gallery. Pieces slid into place, ugly and certain. I set the papers aside and opened the wooden chest in the living room. The cedar scent rose again, steady and grounding. I pulled out my husband's letter, running my thumb over the signature. He'd trusted me to guard what was left, not to hand it over because someone smiled and called it family. I returned to the table and laid the letter beside the folder. The contrast was stark, one page written in love, the other in calculated self-interest, and between them sat me, holding the power to choose which one would define the rest of my life. I took a yellow legal pad from the drawer and began writing notes, not just for myself, but for the attorney I would see. Dates, amounts, clauses to question. The pen scratched across the paper, the sound steady in the quiet room. Outside, the light shifted, the harbor breeze rattling the window. I could hear gulls in the distance, their cries sharp against the muted hum of the street. I wrote until the shadows stretched long across the table. When I finally stopped, the notes filled 3 pages. I gathered the papers, slid them back into the folder, and placed it in the chest under the letter. Then I locked it, the click loud in the stillness. They had made their move. Now I would make mine, but they wouldn't see it coming until it was far too late. The call stopped first. No more Sunday reminders from Thomas, no casual check-ins during the week. The phone sat silent on the counter, its blank screen a constant reminder. Then came the missing invitations. I saw photos online, family dinners, weekend boat rides, gallery events. Faces I'd known for years smiling together as if I no longer existed. The house felt bigger in the quiet. Rooms I used to pass through without notice now held an emptiness I could hear. In the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator seemed louder. In the hallway, my footsteps echoed back at me. One afternoon, I stood at the mailbox, sorting envelopes under the bright Charleston sun. Most were bills. One was a charity newsletter, and one, thick, cream-colored, was from Vanessa. Inside was a card: "Hope you're well. We're keeping busy." Not a single personal detail. No mention of Thomas. It was as if she were writing to a neighbor she barely knew. I placed the card in the desk drawer, shutting it a little too firmly. The air in the room shifted, carrying the faint scent of lemon polish from the morning's cleaning. The effort of keeping things in order felt heavier without anyone to notice. Emily was the only one who came by. She was Thomas's daughter from his first marriage, 24 now, with her father's eyes but her mother's steadiness. She arrived one Thursday evening, arms full of groceries. "You look tired," she said, setting the bags on the counter. I smiled, though it didn't reach my eyes. "It's just been quiet." She unpacked bread, cheese, and fresh peaches. The smell of them sweetened the warm air. "Dad's been different lately," she said. "Vanessa's got her own ideas about family." I poured us each a glass of iced tea, the ice clinking softly. "She's making sure I'm on the outside looking in," I said. Emily met my gaze. "Then I'll sit with you on the outside?" The words landed like a small light in a dark room. We ate simple sandwiches, the bread still soft from the bakery, the peaches leaving juice on our fingers. For an hour, the house didn't feel so hollow. After she left, the silence returned, but it was different now. Less like a void, more like a space I could choose how to fill. I walked into the living room, the evening light spilling across the rug. The wooden chest sat in its corner waiting. Vanessa could try to erase me from their gatherings. She could cut me out of conversations, photographs, and plans. But there were places she couldn't reach, and truths she couldn't touch. And I was beginning to see that sometimes, isolation wasn't just a punishment. It could be the cover you needed to plan your next move. The days blurred into one another. Morning coffee, a quiet walk to the market, evenings with a book I barely read. Without invitations or calls, the calendar felt empty, its pages waiting for someone else's handwriting. Neighbors waved from across the street, polite but distant. Word travels fast in Charleston's old neighborhoods. I could imagine the versions they'd heard. Stories tailored to make me seem forgetful, out of touch, maybe even difficult. One Friday, I stopped at the bakery for fresh bread. The air was warm with the smell of yeast and cinnamon. Behind me, two women chatted over the pastry case. "She's the one from that gala," one whispered. I didn't turn, but the heat rose in my cheeks all the same. At home, I set the bread on the counter and stood there longer than I meant to. The kitchen window framed a stretch of the harbor, sunlight glinting off the water. Boats moved slowly, their wake spreading like quiet declarations they had somewhere to go. In the evenings, I wrote in a journal, not about feelings, those shifted too often, but about facts, dates, encounters, subtle changes in Thomas's tone, moments when Vanessa's hand seemed too close to the family accounts. The pages filled steadily, the ink a dark, deliberate thread. Emily visited when she could, always with groceries or flowers. One night, we sat on the porch with mugs of chamomile tea. The air was thick with jasmine, the crickets loud in the dark. "Have you talked to Dad lately?" she asked. "Not in weeks," I said. "I think that's the plan." She sipped her tea. "He's quieter than I've ever seen him, but he listens to her." "I know," I said. "And she's making sure her voice is the only one he hears." We sat in silence for a while, the night breeze cool against my skin. It was a relief not to have to explain every pause, every sigh. After she left, I walked through the house, switching off lights. Each room held the ghost of its purpose. Chairs waiting for guests, a table set for no one. But the chest in the living room felt different. It didn't wait. It kept. I unlocked it again, just for a moment. The smell of cedar rose, and my husband's letter lay on top, steady as ever. It reminded me that the foundation under me was still there, no matter how many walls they tried to take down. Vanessa could have the gatherings, the whispers, the crafted stories. I would have the records, the patience, and the truth. And sometimes, those were far sharper tools. It started with a phone call from Thomas. "Mom, there's a community fundraiser Saturday. Vanessa thinks it'd be nice if you came." The words were too neat, too prepared. Still, I agreed. Part of me wanted to see what she had planned this time. The Charleston Cultural Hall was already crowded when I arrived. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh flowers. Long tables lined the room, covered with white linens and gleaming silver trays. I wore my navy dress, the same one from the gala, pressed and spotless. If Vanessa wanted to paint me as careless, she'd have to work harder. The heels pinched slightly, but they gave me the height I needed to look her in the eye. She greeted me with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Margaret, you made it," she said, loud enough for nearby guests to turn. Her sequin dress caught the light, drawing all eyes. A string quartet played softly in the corner, but their music seemed far away. I could feel the weight of glances following me as she led me to a table near the stage. "Stay here," she said. "We'll need you for the presentation." I stood among silent auction items, Gift baskets, wine collections, vacation packages. The scent of roses from a nearby arrangement mixed with the faint tang of champagne. When the speeches began, Vanessa took the microphone. Her voice carried easily, smooth and confident. She thanked donors, praised organizers, and then her tone shifted. "And now," she said brightly, "a little lighthearted moment. We have a volunteer who knows how to make an entrance." She beckoned to me. Reluctantly, I stepped forward, the stage lights hot on my face. She held up a silver tray piled with champagne flutes. "Would you mind helping serve our guests?" she asked. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. I recognized the game, reduce me to a server, strip away the dignity of being a guest. I took the tray, its weight awkward in my hands. My palms grew damp against the polished surface. The crystal glasses clinked as I moved through the crowd. "Careful now," someone murmured as I passed. A few people smiled politely, but most looked away, embarrassed for me, or amused. At one table, a man reached for a glass too quickly. The tray tipped, and a splash of champagne dotted my sleeve. A small gasp rose from behind me. Vanessa's voice followed, dripping with mock concern. "Oh dear, Margaret," still struggling with balance. The words stung more than the champagne's chill. I straightened, forcing a calm smile. "No trouble at all," I said, my voice steady. By the time the tray was empty, the music had shifted to something livelier, but I felt no rhythm in my body, only the steady beat of my pulse. I returned the tray to the table near the stage, Vanessa already turned away, laughing with her friends. Walking out into the cool night air, I drew a deep breath. The scent of the harbor was sharp and clean, cutting through the lingering perfume of the hall. She'd wanted to make me small, but she'd only reminded me how far I could rise without her approval. What would you have done in that moment? Play along to keep the peace, or call her out on the spot? I was halfway down the steps when I heard my name again. Vanessa's voice, bright and insistent, carried over the chatter. "Margaret." "Don't go yet. We have a little surprise for you." The guests turned, curiosity flickering in their eyes. I forced a smile and walked back toward the stage. The lights seemed hotter now, the air thicker. A large framed certificate rested on an easel. The gold lettering read Honorary Service Recognition, Margaret Holbrook. It might have been flattering, if not for the text beneath, printed in smaller type. For her years of dedication to the Charleston Hotel Group, now stepping back from active involvement, stepping back. The phrase hit like a stone to the ribs. It wasn't true, but on a stage under lights, truth was whatever the microphone said. Vanessa clapped lightly, encouraging others to follow. "Let's give her a warm send-off," she said. The applause was polite, lukewarm. A few people murmured congratulations as if I'd retired without telling them. I accepted the certificate, its frame heavier than it looked. The glass reflected my face. Calm, but the tightness in my jaw betrayed me. "Thank you," I said simply and stepped off the stage. Thomas stood near the side, hands in his pockets. His eyes slid away when I met them. That hurt more than Vanessa's script. By the exit, a man I didn't recognize stopped me. Tall, silver hair, an expensive watch peeking from his cuff. "I'm on the board," he said quietly. "We'll talk soon." The words were quick, but they rooted in my mind. Someone had seen through the performance. Someone who mattered outside. The night air wrapped around me like a cool cloth. I walked slowly toward my car, the sounds of the event fading behind me. Each step felt deliberate, measured. The certificate rested on the passenger seat, the gold letters catching the glow from the street lamps. I started the engine, the low hum steady under my hands. If Vanessa thought this was my curtain call, she'd misread the script entirely. Driving home, I replayed the man's words. "We'll talk soon." It wasn't just a kindness, it was an opening. Back in my living room, I leaned the certificate against the wall. The wooden chest waited in its corner. I didn't open it, not yet. Instead, I sat in the quiet, letting the humiliation settle into something sharper. Vanessa had shown the room what she wanted them to believe. Now it was my turn to decide what they would see next. If it were you, would you hold back and plan in silence, or confront them before the next move is made? The next morning, the certificate still leaned against the wall, its gold letters catching the pale light. I stepped around it on my way to the kitchen, unwilling to give it another glance. What mattered now was the voice I'd heard last night, steady, certain. "We'll talk soon." I brewed coffee, the dark scent filling the air, and carried the mug into the living room. The wooden chest sat in its corner, patient as always. I set the mug down and knelt beside it. The cedar scent rose the moment I opened it, rich and grounding. I pulled out the folders. Their edges worn smooth from years of storage. At the bottom was a smaller box, one I hadn't touched in years. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. I cut the twine with the letter opener, the metal cool in my hand. Inside, I found a stack of manila envelopes, each labeled with a year. The most recent, 2023, was thicker than the rest. I opened it to find a sheaf of shareholder reports and meeting minutes. The language was dense, but one page stopped me cold, a list of voting rights by percentage. Next to my name, Margaret Holbrook, was a number higher than I'd ever expected. I didn't just have a seat at the table. I could sway decisions entirely. A faint hum from the refrigerator reached me, grounding the moment. This wasn't just theory. It was leverage. Vanessa might play the social game, but the boardroom was mine if I wanted it. Halfway through the stack, I found a handwritten note from my husband, dated 2 months before he passed. It was brief, remember. They can't move without you. His handwriting was slightly shaky, but the message was as firm as ever. I sat back on the rug, the papers spread around me like a map. Outside, the gulls cried over the harbor, their calls sharp against the morning quiet. Each sound seemed to underline the same thought. I'd been sitting on the high ground all along. I gathered the papers and set them on the coffee table, arranging them in order. Then I opened my laptop and began searching for the man from last night. It didn't take long. His name was listed on the hotel group's website as a senior board member. I read his profile, noting the decades of experience, the projects he'd led. If he'd approached me, it was for a reason. I drafted an email, brief, polite but direct, thanking him for his words and suggesting we meet. Before sending, I read it twice, trimming any hint of vulnerability. When I clicked send, a strange calm settled over me. This was no longer about recovering from humiliation. It was about reclaiming what had always been mine. I placed the 2023 envelope on top of the chest and locked the rest away. The key was warm from my hand as I slipped it into my pocket. For the first time in weeks, I felt the house was on my side. The reply came faster than I expected. Barely an hour later, an email from Richard Kessler arrived in my inbox. Short, to the point, let's meet today. The Harbor Club, 3 o'clock. By mid-afternoon, I was walking through the glass doors of the club. The scent of leather and old wood greeted me, mingling with faint cigar smoke. Sunlight poured through tall windows, casting long gold streaks across the navy carpet. Richard was already seated at a corner table, a glass of sparkling water before him. He stood as I approached, his handshake firm. "Margaret?" he said. "I'm glad you came." I sat, the leather chair cool against my back. The hum of quiet conversations filled the space, blending with the soft clink of cutlery. "I saw what happened last night," he began. "That wasn't just a social slight, it was positioning." I tilted my head. "Positioning for what?" He leaned forward, voice low. "She's trying to erode your credibility with the board. If you seem out of touch, your influence fades." I folded my hands on the table. "Then she doesn't know how much influence I have." His smile was brief, approving. "I suspect she doesn't, but some of us do." I reached into my bag and slid the shareholder report across to him. The pages made a faint whisper against the polished wood. "I think this speaks for itself." He scanned the top page, eyebrows lifting. "Well," he said, "that's more than enough to block anything she pushes through." The waiter arrived with menace, the faint aroma of rosemary drifting from a nearby dish. We ordered tea and a light salad, though neither of us seemed focused on the food. Richard outlined the next board meeting, just 2 weeks away. "She'll propose a restructuring, changes that would sideline you entirely. But if you walk in with these numbers..." He tapped the report. The conversation changes. The tea arrived, steam curling upward, carrying the scent of bergamot. I let it warm my hands before answering. "I'm not looking for a fight," I said. "But I won't let her write me out." "Good," he replied. "Because I think you're exactly who we need right now." By the time we finished, the sun was dipping toward the horizon, casting amber light across the harbor outside the windows. I slipped the report back into my bag, the weight of it a steady reminder. As we stood to leave, Richard said, "One more thing. Keep this quiet. The less she knows before the meeting, the better." The cool harbor air met me outside, sharp with salt and the faint diesel scent of passing boats. I walked slowly to my car, each step deliberate. Back home, I placed the report on the desk and locked the door behind me. The house felt different, not less empty, but more secure, as if the walls themselves understood what I carried. Vanessa thought the game was about charm and public perception. She didn't see the numbers, the votes, the rules written long before she arrived. And now, I intended to use every one of them. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was still, but my mind paced the halls. I lay in bed listening to the faint creak of settling wood, the whisper of wind against the eaves. At midnight, I gave up. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and went to the living room. The chest sat in its place, quiet, as though it had been waiting. I didn't open it this time. Instead, I sat at the desk and pulled a legal pad toward me. The lamp's warm light pooled over the paper, turning it a soft gold. I began listing what I knew. Dates, board members, voting records, Vanessa's patterns at public events. Beside each, I marked questions, small threads to pull later. Outside, the harbor was dark, except for the scattered lights of moored boats. They swayed gently, their masts ticking against each other in the breeze. The sound reminded me of the metronome my husband used when tuning his guitar. I thought of his note. They can't move without you. It had been a reassurance then, but tonight it was a challenge. I wanted to know exactly how far it went. At 2 a.m., I brewed tea, the scent of chamomile filling the kitchen. Its warmth settled in my hands but did nothing to slow my thoughts. I considered the timing. 2 weeks until the board meeting, which meant every move had to count. I sketched a rough calendar, calls to make, documents to review, allies to sound out without raising suspicion. The key was to move quietly, like the tide, present but unseen until it was too late. The floorboards were cool under my bare feet as I moved to the window. Charleston slept, the streets empty under the glow of old gas lamps. In the quiet, I could almost hear my husband's voice. "You don't have to fight loud to win," he'd said once, after a bitter contract dispute. "You just have to be the last one standing." I wrote that down, underlining it twice. It would be the spine of my plan. By 3, I returned to the desk and opened my laptop. I searched recent filings, past meeting agendas, any public record that hinted at the restructuring. Pieces began to fit together, new hires aligned with Vanessa's circle, marketing contracts steered to her acquaintances. The room grew cooler as the night wore on, the air tasting faintly of salt from the harbor. Dawn's first light edged the curtains by the time I set my pen down. The list was longer now, the questions sharper. I gathered the pages, slid them into a folder, and tucked it into the locked drawer. Then I stood at the window once more, watching the sky pale over the water. Sleep could wait. For now, I had work to do. By mid-morning, I'd had only 2 hours of sleep. But my mind was clearer than it had been in weeks. The notes from the night before lay open on the desk, edges curling slightly from the lamp's heat. I dressed simply, slacks, a cream blouse, low heels, nothing that would draw attention. From the outside, I was just another woman running errands on a quiet Charleston morning. My first stop was the bank. The polished marble floor clicked under my shoes as I approached the counter. The air smelled faintly of paper and lemon polish. "I'd like to review the status of my shareholder account," I told the clerk. Her eyes flicked to her screen, then back to me with a practiced smile. "Of course, Mrs. Holbrook, we can bring those records to a private room." Inside the small office, I ran my fingers over the crisp edges of the files she set before me. Every figure matched my copies. Nothing had been moved without my signature. The relief was quiet but solid, like a stone in my hand. Back outside, the sunlight was bright, glinting off car hoods and shop windows. I walked 2 blocks to a cafe I knew well, one that was popular with local business owners. The smell of fresh coffee and buttered croissants met me at the door. At a corner table sat David Chen, the group's longtime legal counsel. He'd handled contracts for years, always with a steady hand. I ordered tea, then approached him with a smile. "David, mind if I join you?" We talked in circles at first. Weather, mutual acquaintances, a new bakery opening near the harbor. Then I leaned in, voice low. "I have reason to believe there's a restructuring plan in motion. I want to confirm the scope." His brow furrowed. "I can't discuss confidential matters," he said, but his tone carried a warning more than a refusal. "Just be prepared for surprises at the next meeting." That was all I needed. Confirmation without details was still confirmation. By early afternoon, I was back home. I placed the verified bank documents into the locked drawer with my notes. The folder now held the beginnings of a shield, and perhaps a sword. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, the scent filling the kitchen again. The harbor breeze slipped in through the open window, carrying the faint tang of salt and fuel. It made the air feel alive, charged. Sitting at the desk, I began drafting a timeline, not for my actions but for theirs. Vanessa favored public moves, visible shifts meant to create momentum. If I could anticipate those moments, I could plant obstacles before she even saw me coming. By the time the clock struck 4, I had the first phase mapped. A small call to a board member here, a question to a vendor there, nothing overt, nothing traceable. The plan wasn't about speed, it was about control. And now I had it in my hands. By the next morning, my calendar was no longer empty. Every block of time had a purpose: calls to make, visits to arrange, documents to secure. The silence outside my window felt like the perfect camouflage. I started with the smallest move, a call to a supplier I'd known for 20 years. We talked about their new distribution center before I asked, casually, about recent contract renewals. It didn't take much for him to mention Vanessa's name and the steep discounts she'd been pressing for. I made a note, marking the date and terms. It wasn't incriminating yet, but paired with the right context it would be. The smell of my second cup of coffee drifted up as I leaned back in my chair. Next, I dialed Evelyn Morris, an older board member who'd always respected my husband. We spoke of her garden, the roses blooming early this year. Then I asked how she was feeling about the upcoming meeting. Her sigh was long, thoughtful. "There's tension, Margaret. Lines being drawn. I hope you're ready?" "I'm always ready," I said, keeping my voice warm. But inside, the words rang like steel. By midday, I was at the Public Records Office. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the faint scent of dust and paper filled the narrow aisles. I requested copies of last quarter's filings for the hotel group. The clerk slid the forms across, her fingers leaving faint smudges on the cream paper. There it was, Vanessa's proposed restructuring outlined in neutral corporate language. But between the lines, it was clear she wanted my voting power reduced, my influence diluted. Reading it, my pulse slowed instead of quickened. This was exactly what I needed in black and white. I folded the papers carefully and tucked them into my bag. The city air outside was warm, carrying the scent of magnolia from a nearby courtyard. For the first time in days, I allowed myself a small smile. Back home, I spread the documents across the dining table. Each page felt like a puzzle piece falling into place. On one side, her plan. On the other, my authority, backed by the numbers Richard had confirmed. Late in the afternoon, I called David Chen again. I didn't ask for details, I offered him one. "There's an irregularity in the supplier contracts. I think it's worth checking before the meeting." His pause was telling. "I'll look into it." The sun dipped lower, turning the harbor gold. I sat by the window, watching the light shift across the water. Every move I made today had been small, quiet, but they all pointed in one direction. Vanessa was building a stage for her triumph. She didn't realize I was rearranging the lights, the curtains, the audience, and when the curtain finally rose, she wouldn't like the view. "If you were in my place, holding the evidence, the influence, and the time, would you move now or wait for the perfect moment?" The next day began before sunrise. I wanted to move while the city was still half asleep, before whispers could turn into rumors. The harbor was wrapped in soft fog, muffling the call of gulls. At 6:30, I drove to the old post office building. Inside was a quiet co-working space I sometimes used, far from anyone who might connect me to the hotel group. The scent of fresh paint still lingered in the air, mingling with coffee from a communal pot. I set up in a corner booth, spreading my folders and a fan across the table. This was phase 2. Positioning allies without ever saying the word allies. A short email here, a comment in a professional forum there. Small nudges, easy to overlook. One message to a marketing executive praised her recent campaign, but mentioned the importance of heritage values. Another to a maintenance manager complimented efficiency, then casually referenced how stability was valued by certain board members. Nothing overt. But each note planted a seed. By mid-morning, I called Richard Kessler. His voice was brisk but warm. "I assume you've seen the filings?" "Yes," I said. "And I'm making sure others see them the way they should." He chuckled softly. "Careful, Margaret. You're starting to sound like you enjoy this." I didn't answer that, because maybe I did. Around noon, I took a walk along East Bay Street, letting the sea breeze clear my head. The air smelled faintly of salt and fried shrimp from the nearby pier. Vendors were setting up for the weekend market, their voices low and steady. Back home, I reviewed the supplier contracts again. Patterns emerged. Discounts tied to questionable clauses, rushed renewals signed by people with no oversight authority. It was enough to raise eyebrows at the right moment. I drafted a brief, factual summary. No accusations, just data. Then I printed it, sealed it in an unmarked envelope, and set it aside for the board packet delivery next week. By late afternoon, I was tired but steady. Every action today had been a thread woven into a larger net. Vanessa still thought she was weaving the only pattern. I stood by the window as the sun slid toward the horizon. The water turned from gold to deep blue. The masts of docked boats etched black against the sky. The cool glass under my fingertips felt grounding. In 2 weeks, the boardroom would be full. Voices sharp, eyes watchful. Vanessa would walk in expecting applause. I would walk in carrying silence and the power it held. I locked the day's work in the desk drawer, the key warm in my palm. Tomorrow, the plan would continue. Quiet, patient, inevitable. Tell me, if you were me holding the kind of leverage that could topple someone without a single raised voice, would you use it now or wait until the moment they thought they'd already won? The boardroom smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh coffee. Sunlight poured through tall windows, catching the gleam of silver water pitchers on the side table. The long mahogany table stretched like a runway, lined with leather chairs. I arrived early, placing my folder neatly in front of me. The papers inside were crisp, edges squared, each document a quiet blade. My tea steamed gently beside them, the bergamot scent curling in the cool air. One by one, board members filed in, voices low with polite greetings. Richard Kessler nodded at me from across the table, his expression unreadable but reassuring. Evelyn Morris took the seat to my left, setting her bag down with deliberate care. Then Vanessa entered. Her heels clicked against the floor, her cream blazer immaculate. She smiled too brightly, greeting each person as though hosting a party. When she reached my seat, her eyes flicked to my folder. "Light reading?" she asked, her voice sweet but edged. I met her gaze. "Just keeping up?" The chairperson called the meeting to order. Reports were presented: finance, operations, marketing. I listened, noting who leaned forward, who checked their phones. Every gesture told a story. Finally, Vanessa rose to present her restructuring proposal. Her slides lit the screen with neat bullet points and glossy photos. She spoke confidently, painting a picture of modern efficiency and strategic streamlining. I watched the faces around the table. Some nodded, others frowned slightly, their pens still. When she reached the section on governance changes, I leaned back, fingers resting lightly on my folder. The language was clever, reducing administrative redundancy. By shifting certain voting rights, my voting rights. Richard's gaze met mine briefly. I waited until she finished her pitch, accepting the polite applause that followed. "Before we move to a vote," I said, my voice even, "I'd like to offer some context." Every head turned. I slid the first document from the folder, the paper whispering against the table. "This," I began, "is a summary of supplier contract adjustments over the past 2 quarters. Vanessa's smile faltered for the first time. "These discounts, while beneficial on paper, are tied to clauses that expose us to significant risk." I let the silence stretch, the rustle of pages filling the gap. "Additionally," I continued, "certain renewals were signed without proper board oversight." The air in the room shifted. Interest sharpened, pens began to move, and Vanessa's hand tightened around her pen. I wasn't raising my voice. I didn't need to. The document spoke louder than I ever could. A murmur rippled through the room, soft but insistent. The chairperson leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "Mrs. Holbrook, are you suggesting a breach of procedure?" I didn't flinch. "I'm suggesting that certain decisions were made without full transparency." "That's not procedure. It's oversight failure." Evelyn cleared her throat, flipping through the pages I'd distributed. "These contracts, they bypassed the usual review channels. I've never seen that happen without board approval." Across the table, Vanessa straightened her shoulders. "Every decision I've made has been in the company's best interest. Efficiency requires trust." "Trust," I repeated, letting the word hang. "It also requires accountability." Richard shifted in his seat, his pen tapping once against the tabletop. "I'd like to know why these discounts are tied to exclusivity clauses that limit our vendor options." Vanessa's jaw tightened. Her gaze flicked toward a younger board member, perhaps hoping for backup. Instead, he kept his eyes on the documents. I turned to the next page in my folder. "This is the restructuring outline Vanessa proposed," I said, sliding copies across. "Notice the governance section. The relocation of voting rights directly impacts my stake." The room grew still. Only the faint hum of the projector and the ticking wall clock broke the silence. Several members leaned in, scanning the highlighted passages. "Margaret," Vanessa began, her voice carefully measured, "the changes are about streamlining, not targeting. I met her eyes. If they weren't targeting me, they wouldn't remove my decision-making power in half our operations. The chairperson glanced between us. Vanessa, why wasn't this section discussed in pre-meeting materials? Her lips pressed into a thin line. It was an oversight. We were under time pressure. I heard a quiet, skeptical laugh from the far end of the table. Evelyn closed her folder, hands folded on top. That's a dangerous kind of oversight. I let the words settle, feeling the weight shift in the room. Vanessa had walked in with momentum. Now she was catching her breath, searching for footing. Before we vote? I said, I recommend we postpone this proposal until the contract irregularities are addressed. Richard nodded immediately. I second that. Several other voices joined. Steady, decisive, the current had turned. Vanessa sat back, her smile fixed but thin. I sipped my tea, the bergamot scent warm against the cool air. This wasn't the end, but it was the fracture that would lead there. The chairperson tapped his gavel lightly. We'll take a short recess before deciding on the postponement. Chairs scraped softly as members stood, conversations blooming in low tones. I stayed seated, arranging my papers with deliberate calm. Through the tall windows, I could see the harbor, sunlight glinting on the ripples. The air in the boardroom was cooler now, the earlier tension condensed into focus. Richard approached first, his hand resting briefly on my chair. You've given them a lot to think about? He murmured. I nodded, eyes still on the documents. Evelyn returned from the hallway carrying a cup of coffee. She leaned toward me. Whatever happens next, you've shifted the balance. When the gavel sounded again, everyone took their seats. Vanessa re-entered last, her blazer still perfect, but there was a faint sheen on her forehead. She carried no new papers, just the same stack she'd brought in earlier. The chairperson cleared his throat. Before we move forward, Mrs. Holbrook, you mentioned additional context. I opened the final envelope from my folder. Inside was the shareholder agreement my late husband had updated years ago. The paper was thick, the ink slightly faded at the edges. This agreement, I said, sliding copies to each member, contains a protective clause. It stipulates that my voting rights cannot be altered without my express consent. Vanessa's head snapped toward me. That's outdated. It doesn't apply.
It's still valid. I cut in,
My voice steady. It was renewed in 2019 and filed with the state. You'll find the notarized record attached. The rustle of pages filled the room as they read. Several eyebrows rose. One member let out a quiet whistle. Richard leaned back, arms crossed. Well, that changes things. Evelyn placed her copy on the table. It means this proposal, as written, is not only ill-advised, it's unenforceable. Vanessa tried again. We can amend the language, restructure The chairperson raised a hand. We can, but not today, and not without Mrs. Holbrook's approval. The vote to postpone was unanimous. The proposal was set aside, the screen going dark. Vanessa's smile was gone now, replaced by a controlled stillness. As the meeting adjourned, members gathered their things, several offering me quiet nods. Richard's glance carried a spark of approval. Evelyn gave my hand a brief squeeze. I remained seated until the room emptied, the echo of footsteps fading down the hall. Through the window, the harbor stretched wide and bright. The tide was turning, and this time, it was in my favor. The lobby felt cooler than the boardroom, its marble floors echoing under my steps. The faint scent of lilies drifted from an arrangement near the reception desk. Outside, sunlight caught on the glass doors, making the street beyond seem brighter than usual. I paused for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. The weight of the morning still pressed on my shoulders, but it was a satisfying weight, not the heaviness of humiliation. This was the solidity of having stood my ground. Richard caught up with me near the elevator bank. You handled that better than anyone else could have? He said. I smiled faintly. It wasn't about handling, it was about protecting. He nodded, then glanced toward the far end of the lobby. Vanessa was there, speaking to someone on her phone. Her voice was low, but her free hand moved sharply, as if cutting through air. Even from a distance, I could feel the heat of her frustration. I stepped outside. The breeze carried the salty tang of the harbor mixed with the faint diesel from a passing bus. Evelyn joined me on the sidewalk, adjusting the strap of her leather bag. She's not going to back down, she said. I wouldn't expect her to. I replied. We walked together for a block before parting ways. I took the long route back to my car, past storefronts with window displays of summer linen and hand-woven baskets. The normalcy of it was grounding. Life outside that boardroom kept moving, oblivious to power shifts behind closed doors. Back home, I placed my folder on the desk without opening it. The documents inside had done their work. Now it was a matter of time, letting the ripple spread. The house was quiet. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock in the hallway kept me company. I made tea, the bergamot steam rising to meet me, and settled by the window. From here, I could see the harbor through a thin veil of oak leaves. The water shifted with the wind, each ripple catching a different glint of light. It reminded me of how quickly situations could change, calm one moment, turbulent the next. My phone buzzed with a new email. It was from a junior board member I barely knew. "Thank you for speaking up today," it read. Simple, unsigned except for his initials. But it was enough to tell me that my stance had reached beyond the obvious allies. I closed the laptop without replying. Some things were better left in quiet acknowledgement. The day wore on without urgency. No phone calls from Vanessa. No sudden summons from the chairperson. Just the steady passing of hours, like the tide moving in and out. When evening came, I lit a single lamp in the living room. Its warm glow softened the edges of the room, casting the shelves and the old chest in familiar shadow. I sat there, not thinking of what had passed, but of what was still to come. 2 days passed before I heard from Thomas. His voice on the phone was cautious, almost formal. "Mom, Vanessa thinks you blindsided her?"
"I imagine she does,"
I said evenly. "And do you?" There was a pause long enough for me to hear the creak of his chair. "I don't know what to think right now. I let that hang in the air. Once, I would have filled the silence for him, reassured him, softened the edges. Now I simply waited. "Anyway," he continued, "Vanessa's upset. Maybe you could talk to her." "I think she knows where to find me," I replied. The conversation ended without a goodbye. That evening, I walked through the house with a slow, deliberate pace. The walls held decades of photographs, each frame a quiet witness to time passing. I stopped at one taken on Thomas's first day of school, his small hand gripping mine, eyes bright with trust. It was strange how trust could fade without either party noticing exactly when. In the kitchen, I opened the back door to let in the night air. The scent of honeysuckle drifted in from the garden, mingling with the faint salt from the harbor. Somewhere in the distance, a ship's horn sounded low and steady. The next morning brought a letter, hand-delivered, the envelope thick and cream-colored. Inside was a brief note from the chairperson, thanking me for my commitment to the integrity of our governance. Beneath his signature was a simple line, "Your presence is valued." I folded the letter carefully, placing it in the desk drawer alongside my husband's papers. It wasn't flattery, it was a reminder that my place here wasn't by accident. Still, the house felt heavier than it should. The quiet that once soothed me now pressed in. I found myself standing by the old chest again, tracing its edges, wondering if my husband had ever felt the same pull toward change. By afternoon, I'd made a decision. I opened the wardrobe in the guest room and began sorting through clothes, some to keep, some to give away. The rhythm of folding and stacking was oddly calming. I called a realtor I trusted, asking her to discreetly look for smaller properties outside the city. "Waterview? If possible," I said. She promised to be in touch within the week. That night, I sat on the porch with a blanket over my knees, watching the harbor lights flicker against the dark water. The tide was on its way out, pulling with it the debris of the day. It struck me that leaving this house wouldn't be a loss. It would be a release. I thought of Vanessa, of Thomas, of the careful way power had shifted in that boardroom. None of it had been loud, but all of it had been permanent. When I finally went inside, I left the porch light on, casting a steady glow into the night. For the first time in months, I felt ready to step away from what had been, toward whatever was next. The cottage stood at the edge of the inlet, its white clapboard siding weathered but solid. A narrow path of crushed seashells led from the road to the porch, crunching under my shoes. The air smelled of brine and pine, carried by the steady wind off the water. Inside, the rooms were smaller than the house I'd left, but they felt like mine instantly. The living room's wide windows framed the inlet, the tide curling in slow silver ripples. I set the box of my husband's papers on a low table by the window. Unpacking was unhurried. Each object found its place with purpose. A quilt folded over the arm of the sofa, the old tea set on the shelf above the sink, the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. Nothing was excessive, yet everything held meaning. That first evening, I brewed tea and carried it out to the porch. The sun dipped low, brushing the horizon with pink and gold. A pair of herons waded near the shore, their slow movements mirrored in the still water. I thought about the boardroom, the tension, the careful words. They felt distant now, like a chapter I'd finished reading. Here, the only sound was the tide and the occasional call of a gull. The next morning, I walked into the village. Following the scent of fresh bread from the bakery, the woman behind the counter greeted me with a smile that reached her eyes. "You must be new here?" she said. I nodded. "Just moved in by the inlet." She wrapped a loaf in paper, her hands quick and sure. "Best eaten warm," she advised. I promised I would. Back at the cottage, I opened the windows wide. The sea breeze slipped through, carrying the sound of distant boat engines. I set the bread on the counter, tore off a piece, and let the warmth spread through me. There was no rush now, no meetings, no calculated silences. The quiet here was different. It wasn't absence, it was presence. That afternoon, I sat at the desk facing the inlet and began writing letters. Not to Thomas, not to Vanessa. These were for old friends I'd lost touch with, for neighbors I hadn't seen in years. It was time to rebuild connections that mattered. The kettle whistled softly from the kitchen, and I realized I was smiling without meaning to. Healing didn't have to be grand. Sometimes, it was just a day shaped by choice, in a place that felt like home. By the second week, the cottage felt less like a retreat and more like an anchor. Each morning, I brewed tea before sunrise and sat on the porch, watching the first light spill across the inlet, turning the water into liquid gold. The air held a crisp saltiness that woke me better than coffee ever had. One morning, I opened the cedar chest and spread its contents across the dining table. Old photographs, property deeds, investment ledgers, all laid out in neat rows. I wasn't just reviewing them for myself. I was creating a record, a map for whoever would come after me. It struck me how many women I'd known who'd left nothing but scattered memories, their stories dissolved into whispers. I didn't want that for my life. Legacy wasn't just about money. It was about clarity, about leaving no room for someone else to rewrite the truth. I bought a thick leather, bound ledger from the village stationery shop. Its pages were heavy, almost creamy under my fingers. Each evening I wrote details of the hotel shares, dates of key decisions, and letters to my younger self, explaining the choices I'd made. By mid-month, I had filled 20 pages. It wasn't morbid work, it was grounding. It reminded me that my life was more than its conflicts. It was a series of choices, some painful, others quietly triumphant. One afternoon, I invited Evelyn to visit. We sat at the small kitchen table, a plate of lemon scones between us. She listened as I explained my plan to formalize the documents, to ensure my estate passed without loopholes or manipulation. "You're doing more than protecting yourself," she said. "You're building a shield for whoever comes next." Her words stayed with me long after she left. That night, I walked the shoreline as the tide receded, my feet sinking slightly into the damp sand. The stars reflected in the shallow pools left behind, tiny sparks mirroring the sky. I realized then that healing wasn't just about stepping away from pain. It was about shaping the space beyond it, a space where my voice, my choices would remain intact. When I returned to the porch, the cottage lights spilled a warm glow onto the path. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the mingled scents of salt and pine. This place, this peace, was mine, and from it I would leave a legacy no one could erase.